our speaker for today, Angela Vergara, who received her PhD at UCSD and who has written extensively on workers and the Pinochet regime, as well as labor in the wine industry and mining and silicosis, among many other topics. Her publications include Fighting Unemployment in 20th Century Chile with University of Pittsburgh Press, a very important special issue of Radical History Review on the other September 11th, Chile 1973, Memory, Resistance, and Democratization. She has a co-authored book on company towns in the Americas, Landscape, Power, and Working Class Communities with University of Georgia Press, and Copper Workers, International Business, and Domestic Politics in Cold War Chile. Her current project is entitled Dangerous Work, an Environmental and Labor History of Modern Latin America. And I also want to mention that she's the general editor of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Latin American History, which I really want to make a plug for because I think a lot of people don't know what a useful teaching resource it is. It's fantastic. And Angela teaches at Cal State LA, and her talk today is called Chinchillas, From Wilderness to Breeding Farms, from the Andes to Southern California. So let's give a warm welcome to Angela.
So good afternoon. Many thanks for having me here and the opportunity to present my new research on chinchillas that has been a sort of project I have had on the side for a long time, but trying to bring together history of animals, history of commodities, and also environmental history, as well as connecting between Chilean and California history. So it has a lot of different angles. So let me start with
this one.
I want to start with the story because what we usually know about chinchillas have to do with goat and pelts. And this is a picture of Lily Pons, who was an opera singer in the 1930s. And she's displaying there in 1939 what was called a very finest chinchilla. That coat that you see there, it was made with at least 110 pelts of chinchillas. So they were all sewed together. At the time, in 1939, most of chinchillas in the wilderness, they were extinct, so you couldn't really find them anymore. There were some chinchillas in captivity that were worth at least $1,000 each. So in general, you will have a single skin is worth from $150 to $450 at the time. So you can just make the math of how much her coat lasted. Our chinchilla at the time was not only expensive, but it was not only a luxury. But behind that, you have a whole history of how pelts were moved across the Western Hemisphere. And what I really want to understand in this story is how this small and very soft and very beautiful animal from the Andes eventually made its way all the way to California and all the way, especially to LA. So my research can touch on different issues. I talk a little bit about hunting, what I call the first cycle of extraction that took place in the north of Chile. Then eventually I moved into how the chinchillas were domesticized and acclimatized, especially in LA and especially in England, and eventually how that came to create a new kind of fur boom by the 1950s and 1960s. I explore what I call this sort of a journey of the chinchilla. Especially from this long track from the Andes all the way to LA, and eventually beyond that into Canada and other parts of the world. Tracing the chinchilla is hard. You know, it's a small animal. it's hard to see in the wilderness, and now it's almost extinct, but also because it was kind of marginal. There are a few chinchilla called. It was not the llama, it was not the guanaco that attracted all kind of attention. It's small, it's got a squirrel, it's cute. Because of that, it's hard to find it in the sources. It doesn't really appear too much in the archives. There is, however, some sort of magazines like the National Chinchilla Breeders Association magazine that was published from the 1940s all the way to the 1960s, and it appears mostly sometimes in newspapers, in news sometimes, but it's always marginal. So for me, it has been a way of trying to face so many diverse sources, trying to find in statistics how many belts left, trying to find in scientific journals, because there was some discussion there, but it's not really, you don't go to the archive and find the chinchilla collection, that doesn't exist, it's even in a National History Museum, it's left in sort of the background, it's too small to really attract attention. But when I look at the story, and this is part of the arguments before we get into that, I really sort of built on the idea of entanglement, of how there is a relation between non-humans and human animals. And that's what's the relation between humans and these animals. But also I'm interested in understanding the chinchilla place on its natural habitat, and how extinction also came as a consequence of the destruction of where they live, the vegetation, and also the desertification of its original habitat. And also looking into the relation between local communities and global market. It's such a small animal from such a specific region, and how that connected eventually to this global market. And last, I'm also looking into the production of knowledge. I know I covered a lot of topics, but especially here, there's a lot of discussion about scientific knowledge, especially about animals and about nature. But the chinchilla actually was not produced by scientists, the knowledge. It was produced by ranchers and by locals, and how they observed, they wrote about it, they recorded information. So I'm also interested in seeing this relationship between these ranchers, especially in the US, and this global kind of scientific knowledge that was published in famous journal. In doing this, I'm sort of building, I would say, in three kind of historiographical debates that I'm trying to mix. I come from commodity history. I'm a mining scholar. So that was my first approach, understanding the price of the chinchilla, and how it became a global commodity. And that helped me to understand the place of chinchilla in the capitalist system. It was something that circulated. It was something that was traded. It was something that was advertised. It was something that had a price and was shaped by consumer demand. But there's more of that, and that's why I'm looking also into animal history, although I'm very new to that, but especially about how an animal could be described as beautiful, as friendly, as cute, as almost a toy. There was one newspaper that described it as like an Easter bunny, and they would visit the farm, but at the same time, it became a pet that you can wear. So I'm looking also in understanding that complicated relationship that humans also establish with animals, that they can abuse them, they can be cruel to them, but can also love them, and how that works and how that changes over time. My main sort of argument here that I'm proposing is that the fur industry was very resilient. It was really able to breed the chinchilla eventually for a short time, and was able to pass from a boom that was based on wilderness in the 19th century to a new kind of fur era that was based on breeding fur animals. And I think that story has not been told enough. We tend to think about the fur trade as the wilderness, the trappers and all that kind of stuff, but we don't think about furs. And we don't think about that sort of industrial landscape that furs became. And it's still there, minks are still being farmed for fur, we still have leather. That is also part of this industry. So I think by looking at chinchilla, I'm also kind of trying to understand better how the foreign industry continues to adapt to new regulation, to extinction, to new demands or new sensibilities that people may have. At first, if you don't know much about the chinchilla, unlike other animals from Latin America, was not really identified by Spanish colonists or travelers till very late. The reason was that it was too small. People were obsessed with llamas and guanacos and all kind of Andean fauna, and it's hard to see a chinchilla because a nocturnal animal too. So that delayed what I call the sort of scientific Western description of the chinchillas. The chinchillas appear in national history of the Spaniards, but as in many of these cases, they were usually mislabeled. They were called a squirrel or they were called a rat. They were called there was a lot of misuse of the language. This classic kind of thing that you find on the Spanish sources. They did not have the language to describe Latin American animals. Eventually, they captured chinchilla. I'm going to make this scientific story short. They captured chinchilla and it arrives alive, which is key for scientific observation, to the London Zoo in the 1820s. In London is where they really observed it from this sort of scientific kind of Western view. So chinchilla gets identified as two species in 1824 by Bennett, who was at the time the president of the Zoological Society in London. There were identified two species of chinchilla. One that is the chinchilla lanigera, that is usually called the one with a long tail. That is mostly sometimes called the Chilean chinchilla. And then a second chinchilla was identified by a German scientist in 1830. That is called the Chinchilla brevicaudata, sometimes also called the Bolivian chinchilla, that has a short tail. The most valuable one was the lanigera, but eventually, when that gets extinct, they start valuing the other one as well. Eventually, in captivity, and that's one key aspect of this, most scientists today said you actually cannot know how many species of chinchillas were because they're extinct. And because the sources are not precise in the late 18th and early 19th century, and it was a time of rapid ecological change, we never really know how many there were. So sometimes they call Chinchilla boliviana, and there's still doubt whether that's a third type or it's the same, used with a different name. Also, chinchilla in captivity changed, especially as they were acclimatized in the northern hemisphere, and their color and the coat changed too. And also because they start mixing them, and they try to breed a better kind of chinchilla. So what you may have in the 17th, 16th, or 18th century can be very different of what you have today because animals have changed over time. My research moves into understanding what I call the first cycle of extraction that that takes place in the extraction of wild chinchilla. And basically, you have two maps here. This one. But on the left, you have a map of Chile, and then here in the second map, you can see there is this here part that is usually called the Puna de Atacama. That is a borderland with Bolivia and Peru and includes part of Argentina too, especially Jujuy and Salta. That's where you find the short-tailed chinchilla. Those birds have moved by the 1830s, 1840s. They were traded through San Pedro de Atacama. That was an old kind of indigenous town, and eventually were traded through the port of Antofagasta and then to global market. The other kind of chinchilla was found around here, was called Chile Norte Chico, the small north, south of the Atacama Desert. And most of those furs went out through Copiapó. Furs really until 1900, and if you look at statistics of exports, most of the boom started in the 1840s, 1850s. That's when you start seeing them appearing in the statistic as thousands of furs leaving the country. Most of them went to Europe until 1900, and most to Germany. That was the big kind of fur market. Eventually, some also to the UK. By 1900, there is a shift in which furs start arriving in the US, mostly to New York. That became known as the fur capital of the world. That was not only where furs arrived, but also where all the manufacturers were located. And there's a high concentration of pelters in New York City after 1900. I focus mostly on this part where I do also part of what I call like a more environmental study of this. I focus on the Norte Chico, that is the region around Copiapó, which I call a landscape of extraction. And Norte Chico is interesting, not only because it had a chinchilla, but because many geographers, as early as the 1960s and 1970s, start calling it like the sort of ground zero to understand climate change. It was a region that had a very kind of early extraction since the colonial time. It was a mining region. It was a region where troops moved. It was a region that was so fragile because it was a desert that was easily and fastly destroyed. In many ways, we focus a lot in the colonial times in the Caribbean as a sort of how Spanish colonization completely destroyed and cut the forest and all of that. The Norte Chico is similar, but because it was a desert, sometimes tends to be ignored. It's like there's a lot of discussion. Well, there was nothing really there, but there was a lot there. It was a very fragile ecosystem, and that's where the chinchilla live. And the chinchilla became part of what I call the cycles of extraction in the Norte Chico, of how there was mining first, and many will argue that mining led also to discover the chinchilla. So how all these extractive activities that were somehow connected and eventually led to devastation in the norte, in the region. It's also interesting to see what was the place of local communities there. Although some of them were indigenous, some of them were peasant communities, they were really impoverished. And eventually, because of climate change that happened very early, there was this cycles of drought. And as they didn't have a means to survive, they also engaged into hunting and collection. So they also became part of this sort of extraction. I mean, they were kind of the product of the commodity chain, but they were not into protecting the chinchilla neither. Because of poverty, they were pushed into this cycle of extraction and destruction in the Norte Chico. What is also a sort of like I have some sources here, but most of the discourse also from scientists at the time, they blame the hunters. So in the description of the Norte Chico, you start seeing what are killing the chinchillas. That also called them primitive. So it's a very fascinating kind of cycle that you see, okay, who are engaged into this trade. There were actually what we call the Chinchilleros, that were the hunters, that are described as primitive, as violent, in the case of Argentina, as indigenous, as mestizo, and somehow that will explain their kind of behavior. So most of the discussion many times focus on blaming the very bottom of the commodity chain, the people who were working there, the people who had no other issue. So for instance, here reading from Eduardo Holmberg, who was the director of the Buenos Aires Zoo, and he described the hunters as highly skilled hunters who will soon finish this species. Another one described him as lean, muscular, with a tan complexion, large feet, with proportionally larger thumbs. The skin of the feet looks like the skin of an elephant. And he's referring to the hunters, not to the chinchillas. He also said they lack basic hygiene, and many carry old scars or smallpox. So somehow they became a caricature, like these hunters who are very violent and exterminating the chinchillas. By 1900, basically the destruction was so fast. It was the boom started in 1840, but really big by the 1880. And by 1900, most people were saying there are no chinchillas left. They really wiped out most of the chinchillas population there. And that led to a generation of scientists, naturalists, sort of this kind of Latin American experts from the 1900s, that sometimes we call them conservationists, that they were really trying to understand nature, but also in a very rational way. They were trying to conserve, but also they want a rational exploitation of nature, and that was their main idea. They wanted to eliminate the chinchilleros, the wild wolves. They want to not to protect the animal because it was beautiful or because it contributed to some sort of wildlife diversity, but because it was valuable. And the valuable, therefore, had to be protected and safe for the country wealth. So there's a whole generation that started writing in the 1900s that would talk about the chinchilla, that tried to establish laws, that was trying to establish some regulation. You cannot kill female chinchillas, you cannot kill during the breeding season, you cannot kill very small chinchillas, all kind of regulation in order to try to protect the animal. But regulation moved really slow. There was some laws established in 1912 that restricted for 5 years the hunting, but because it was a border region, you didn't have all the countries involved, the belt circulate. So they got them out through Buenos Aires and they came back to Chile. So trade continued until there was, most of the sources until there was nothing to hunt. That's the sort of the drama of this first cycle. I wanted to explain, sorry, I forgot that part. This image on the left, that's called an algarrobilla, and it's actually a shrub that is used, that has high content of tannin, that's used to soften leather. And that shrub was also the main food for the chinchillas. But that shrub also had a value. So at the same time they start hunting chinchilla, they start also harvesting the shrub so fast that the shrub eventually also disappeared. So some sources said the chinchilla dies because there was no food. Others say the hunters tried to burn down the area to get the chinchilla out before they destroyed the algarrobilla. So what happened first is unclear. But both things got extinct at the same time. And that's part of what I'm trying also to make the argument that we need to understand not only the animal in isolation, but also in its environment. What happened, what was also changing, what other products were being collected and transformed. Okay, so now we get to LA and start the second phase. Basically, in the 1920s, Matthias Chapman, who had been a sort of a miner, some sources will call him an engineer, but I checked every census information. He actually didn't even have a high school degree. He was a classic kind of self-made kind of miner from the West Coast. He was originally from Oregon, made into LA by World War I. Sort of kind of like Anglo migration. Eventually, he get a contract with a mining company and moved to Chile. He can also work at some point in Arizona mining, comes back, and goes to Chile. In Chile, he discovered the chinchillas. He had not experience with chinchillas, but is describing all the sources that He met trappers, which were very common at the time. He loved cow hiking in the Andes. There's picture of him hiking around and then riding horses. And eventually he decided to come back after the end of his contract and bring with him 11 chinchillas to LA. He designed bringing chinchillas across hemisphere was especially hard. You not only have to move them from a high altitude to the ocean level, but also you have to change season, which for like a furry animal means that they will lose their coat. You also have to keep the temperature cow stable, and this is the 1920s and above, so it's not that easy. And he designed, that's what all the sources say, he designed a box in which he had a fan, a manual fan, and then ice. And he took turns with his wife on keeping the fan and the ice all the way to San Pedro. He arrived in San Pedro with his 11 chinchilla. One died, but one was born, so he still has 10. Moves first to the Sierras, to like a small town in the Sierra, but was too cold. And eventually he bought a farm here in England. I think the address have changed since the 1930s, so it's hard to place it, but it's supposed to be right now in the border between Inglewood and Lennox. He opens a farm by what he would call the South American farm. He became a successful rancher. He eventually gained knowledge, got to have like hundreds. By the time he died, like in the 1930s, so in 10 years, he had more than 500 chinchillas in England. He received all kinds of visitors. This became a sort of an attraction in LA. People who come to LA will go and visit the farm because you can actually see the chinchillas and pet them. He was a breeder. He never killed a chinchilla. It was said that he loved animals, and he had all other kind of animals. One of the key of his success, and he became really famous for that, was that the production of knowledge. He studied the animals, and that's why he had been successful in moving the chinchillas all the way from Chile. That it's not there was any scientific material for him. He had not animal knowledge more than observing the animals or talking to trappers. But that knowledge of how he observed and how he cared made him successful. So he studied the animal, he weighed the animal, eventually decided what they could eat, and all kind of stuff. When his son inherited the business, his son inherited the business in Inglewood, and eventually he opened an additional farm in Big Bear that became very big and very famous, especially because Big Bear already had fox farm. And that it was already stored in the cow like belt business. But his farm became famous for having sort of medical service for other ranchers. They really study I think they conducted surgery or some sort of medical thing on the chinchillas there in 1937. Eventually, by the 1950s, he provided all kinds of service for ranchers all over the nation. He had vaccines and studies, all kinds of ailments and cow studies. It's in part of the time there was almost no knowledge about the chinchillas. It was not an animal that had been studied that much. So all of this knowledge was produced by people who were ranchers and raising the animals at home, basically. The chinchilla, that's a fascinating couple. I call them. I know the picture is not that good. Basically, by the late 1930s, people started dreaming about chinchillas in the US and even Canada. They thought it could make you rich. It was compared to gold in a sort of similar kind of fever that you didn't need a lot of skills, that you didn't need to have a lot of knowledge, but you could, like if you work hard, you could discover and become rich. And this is from a sort of cartoons, kind of comics from the time from 1937, the Washtabs and Captain Easy, that basically tell the story. It's like a fictional story. These guys are hired to hunt for chinchillas and they're sent to the Andes. arrive in the Andes and have kind of like classic stereotypes. They find kind of like stereotypical indigenous people. Somehow the story became very inaccurate because they end in the Amazon. And that's where they find the chinchillas and they finish sort of navigating here the Amazon to become rich and fight the chinchillas. Eventually, some evil guy steals the chinchillas, then left with a few ones and sort of thinking, oh, I really want to be rich. And then the other guy said, well, let's look for gold now. So I find the story, despite the fact that it's like extremely inaccurate about all the scientific, all the geographical location, full of stereotypes. It starts telling you a little bit why there was a story about this, what kind of impact it had on people who were reading comics, and why was Chinchilla sort of popular culture by the 1930s in a way that is not now, and that led me into looking at what happened after Chapman and how the Chapman model of the South American farm in LA got sort of replicated in other parts of the country. By the 1940s, there was what is called a sort of a ranch sprawl. Now, people were raising chinchillas everywhere. There were farms all over California, but also all the way, this is from Oregon. There were big farms with hundreds of chinchillas, but there were also couples raising a few pairs of chinchilla at home. One of the sources said the key thing or the unique thing about chinchilla ranchers is that you don't need a ranch. You only need a basement. So people were sort of mesmerized by the idea of raising chinchillas. For instance, this is a source that this the ranch try to describe this landscape of ranchers. And it says among the teams of racers was a 16-year-old in partnership with his dad, two women nearly 60 as partners. Partnership of 4 men, of brothers, of sisters, school teachers, contractors, professional men. More numerous than all were those of man and wife. There were the rehabilitation aspect too. Were parents often handicapped, widows, widowers, retired persons from so many walks of life, and other with psychological or emotional problems, seeking solace in Chinchilla's appeal and the quietness of their girl. And there's a lot of articles I've been finding of sort of interviews with people who were having chinchillas. There was a ward bearer in a wheelchair in Santa Ana that had made a whole adaptable kind of farm so he could take care of the chinchillas. Then there was this other ward bearer in Big Bear who somehow met a wife in England, brought her back, and then raised chinchilla, and the little child was in love with the chinchillas. There were descriptions of how the breeders would give them names. How the chinchillas have personalities, how they learn how to feed them, and a sort of almost in a very cute kind of description of this industry of people breeding and breeding chinchillas. Most of them, although it's not said, but they were actually, you had to have some capital. It's not that you were a working class, kind of poor person trying to raise chinchillas. They were kind of middle class in some ways, but trying to have this side business that would be this ranching activity. There were rural farms that they were tend to be bigger, some bigger farms, etc. The bigger farms, they became the most successful one. That's from Roanoke, Indiana, one of the biggest farms that was stayed over time. This is the Coffmac Chinchilla Ranch in Quebec. So they spread all over kind of western, eventually all the way to the east, and eventually all the way to Canada. Canadians were really proud of their chinchillas, saying that because of the cold weather, they were actually down. That the US chinchillas, they have like more like better fur, and the colors was nicer. Some of the big ranchers and the most successful one, they also were not only chinchillas, but also have mink. So there were, and it's unclear whether they were mink or chinchilla first. I would think that they were mink farmers, that they tried to have some chinchillas. The, I actually have some of like postcard here that you can see there. One thing that becomes really amazing is that there were postcards. You know, people advertising, and it's a business. So the big farms, you could like go there, buy a postcard, pet the chinchillas. They became a sort of touristic attraction in the 1950s. They also sort of compete on the quality of their chinchilla. This was from the Canadian farm, and it says a 2 weeks old chinchilla baby posing with a watchful mother. And somehow you get confused who is the mother, you know? My first was like, is the human called the mother? And then actually you realize that it's a real chinchilla mother there. But most of the pictures are like that, you know, you are paying the chinchillas and you have a sort of like, I guess they're really soft, you know? So you want to hold them, it's like a little cat or a little rabbit. By the 1950s, however, there is a big change in the industry. Chinchillas have been bred in the US and Canada for almost 30 years by then. And then there's a lot of discussion that the industry need to transition to pelting. You know, that the ultimate motive of raising chinchilla is for fur. You cannot just breed chinchilla for fun. You know, eventually the kind of business mind that it says you have to pelt them. But Pelham was hurt. You know, all the small ranchers of people who had 2, 3, 4, 6 birds with chinchillas could not make it into the pelting cow level. You need to have at least 200 chinchillas to pelt, you know, to keep it breeding. And then you have annual pelting, you know, so you have to sort of expand and escalate the service. Also, you have to become much more, that's what all the articles said, are like recommendations to breeders. You have to start saving money. You have to mass produce chinchillas. So there is a whole change in how they talk to chinchilla, first in the breeding part as this sort of cute animal, and then as a commodity and as a business. Therefore, they said, stop giving them names, stop building cute houses and special food, but save money. And the same money, it means big kind of house. And as you can see much of the picture there, but you know, these big lines, more crowded conditions, because it needs to be efficient. So the chinchilla lose somehow this special status as an animal that was close to humans to become the sort of animals that can be built and that you can keep your distance from that before you can build them. We also, although the pelting part takes place in a different farm, the first part of killing the animal and fleshing and cleaning the fur needs to take place in the breeding farm. And then it was sent to big pelters. So those it means also you have to learn how to do that. And it needs to do, and because the animal was so small, it needs to be done manually. And that means learning about killing, and all kind of stuff that breeders were not aware of that. Only the big ranchers were able to do that. So by the mid-1950s, and that's where I am, I see a sort of reorganization of the industry in which most of the small kind of breeders are disappearing. And it's the time of the big kind of ranchers. And that's when conditions really deteriorate. And this is a news from Santa Ana it's actually 1970s, in which there was this big fire on a warehouse where there were more than 1,000 chinchillas, and all the chinchillas died in the fire. But I also would tell you about conditions. You know, how they became what I would call a sort of, yes, a tiny element in this mass production chain of the fur industry. And it becomes much more similar to what we know about minks today, you know, of how they're abused and fed and kept in sometimes horrible conditions only for the benefit on the plow. So that's a sort of a shift And I haven't really explored that much because I ended in 1950s, but it means to start looking more into the pelting. So who was left out of the business, how the business was remade, and how long it survived. I have sources that especially by the 1970s and early 80s, there was also an attack on the fur industry, because of animal rights and all of that. So to what extent that also affected chinchilla when the chinchilla started disappearing from the whole kind of fur market. So that's still kind of open question. And last, although I don't get into that, still on this paper, the chinchilla went global. By the 1960s, this firm in what was at the time the land was today Botswana, and that's something that someone found in the US and the UK archive. And actually, they were trying to breed for chinchilla in Botswana and South Africa at the time to consider again something that could be done small. And that somehow, again, with similar kind of dream of prosperity, that you can maybe start a sort of like pelting service. So, thank you.
So now for questions.
Thank you for an incredibly interesting talk. And I think that it's a fascinating project, and it traverses so many issues. I mean, it's got like so many dimensions to it that, you don't often see in kind of the animal studies world. But I guess concretely, I want to ask about the labor. I mean, I'm familiar with the history of slaughterhouse labor in the United States. I mean, how, it became, it was a very important means of upward mobility for African Americans, and then now it's completely, immigrant labor. But so I wondered how the pelting. I mean, it must have been very difficult and unpleasant.
I'm a labor historian, so I did start with a lot of labor questions first, but I didn't find a lot. I think a lot, but I found, especially for the breeding part, is there was a lot of family labor. That it was sort of women and children all taking care of the chinchillas, that it was one of the main complaints of small rancho was they became a very intense work. You first think that you can just have the chinchillas, because chinchillas somehow were easy, because they're vegetarians, they didn't have a lot of disease. And they didn't have a lot of infection, especially like fox. And there was no big disease or nothing affected the chinchillas. But they were tricky in the breeding part because they were monogamous. So that made it tricky in terms of trying to keep the chinchillas together and all that. So a lot of the ranchers says that you have to feed them at a certain time, that some of the chinchillas like music or whatever take. So it became intense work, but it seems to be mostly family labor. I know, for instance, when I had the labor question, I went to the census. I'm a Latin American historian, so I'm still trying to figure out my LA part of history. But I found the census fascinating in the US because you get all this kind of labor category. And I found around Inglewood, La Brea, and what today is Lenox, a lot of people that were described as sort of farm workers. So I assume they were working in some of these farms as day labor and all of that, but seems to be mostly white labor. Mm-hmm. A lot of them, people who work in the industry in this first cow breeding, they seem that eventually they became breeders themselves. And then I have cases in the big bird mostly. People say, I was working there, eventually I saved money and bought my own pair of chinchilla because I learned so much. So that is, I still don't know much about the pelting part. There were other parts that I think that was connected to labor, is that chinchilla require a lot of other stuff. So, so there will be the food industry, special food for the chinchillas. There will be the cages, and the entertainment wheels. All of that stuff that we think are obvious, at the time they were not designed. So eventually you have factories that they were specialized on chinchilla wheels and stuff like that. But the labor parts keeps being elusive. I think I need to understand better the ranching culture and how it was organized to be able to better understand the labor part. Yes, right.
So especially, once again, thank you for a fascinating talk. So given especially early on the difficulties transporting chinchillas to another continent and another climate, and given the early concern in Chile about their diminishing numbers, why weren't they farmed extensively in Chile?
In Chile,
Yes.
there was not extensively, but they tried to, this is especially in the 1920s, where the sort of kind of a state, kind of like fomento, the kind of industry. So there were efforts to have state farms or to give money to that. But they didn't succeed. There was one farm that was owned actually by a German, a different German than Albert, another German in the north of Chile. And then what I found is he did a short-tail chinchilla, became very successful in the 40s and 50s. And in the advertisement, he says those belts eventually became coats for Hollywood stores. And he says that in the local media, there were pictures of all the Hollywood stars wearing those belts. But I haven't found any evidence of that. So I think it wasn't that successful for some reason. I don't know if the distance from the belting would have been in a sense that there was no purpose of breeding chinchillas so locally. I'm not sure why. I'm still kind of puzzled by the Latin American part of that. And then in the 1950s, there is no mention of farms. In the National Breed Association, they have all these international kind of articles. And the only reference I found is to a farm in Uruguay, which makes no sense. No. But that's all what I could find for some reason.
So, but you anticipated the next question, which is from our colleague in history, Fernando Perez Montesinos, who asked, you kind of already answered it, but perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on it. He'd like to know more about the connections between the chinchilla fur business and the Hollywood/celebrity industry.
I think there are two things with the celebrities and the breeding. Celebrities love their coats, and most of them they will wear all the chinchilla coats and other belts in the 1940s and 50s. But they also, what I could see in the local media, they love to be photographed. So they visited farms, and they were photographed there. There is another one that I found a video of a British star also visiting farms wearing her big chinchilla coat. So I think it was this sort of, for us, a sort of contradictions, but for them it was sort of just looking at the source of their animals or something like that. But I haven't explored the cultural part of the connection.
Any other questions from the room?
Oh, sorry.
Fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. So I have a suggestion about this, like the farming side and things like that. So in the literature around family farms in the U.S., that it's discussed that largely poultry is something that the women, the farm wives and children handle, because versus the field labor is, that's the men's domain. So I wonder if there's something about that, people are coming from there, there's many people are coming from the Midwest and the South to Southern California, and maybe they're looking to recreate a kind of farm life. And here's one of the ways in which it kind of articulates into this new commodity, not eggs, but chinchillas, and people have these relationships with their animals too, that whether they were hens or sheep or whatever.
I think that makes a lot of sense because also England was big in poultry.
Yeah. Oh.
So before there's this TV shows that talks about how before aviation was poultry. So there was a lot of knowledge maybe for the small kind of domestic farming of small animals where women and children had a bigger role in tendering that. And I have interviews, not about California, but about farms in the Midwest and other parts, in which the journalist said, if you want to know, you have to talk to the wife. You would think they know nothing, but they know all the everyday kind of maintenance of the animals, what food they like, and all that kind of stuff. So that makes sense. Thank you. That makes sense.
I think I just missed it, but in terms of the pelt, like thinking of chinchillas for their pelt versus as pets, were those kind of trades in parallel happening at the same time, or it's after kind of what you mentioned, the fur, sort of the social turn against fur that they become more of a pet, or were they?
So
were they
then,
pets earlier?
sorry, so the last part.
Whether they were pets early on, whether they were in the
Oh,
trade
mhm.
included pets early on, or whether they were only for their for a long time.
They were pets. It's hard to know. I mean, they have always been used for pelt, even in pre-Columbian time. There are sort of archaeological kind of news about how people were buried with chinchilla first. So there's always a practical use of the chinchilla. How eventually they became pets, I think, is that complicated relation we have with domestic animals, and I think especially in farms. You can have your dog as a pet and eventually it's made a soup, So that kind of, I think, that complicated relation is always there. There is a practical use of the chinchillas, that the reason you're going to have a chinchilla is because of the fur. And how I think, I haven't got that deep into animal history to understand how that understanding of pets has changed over time. I think there's some literature on that a lot, of how we commodify animals and how that sort of views change and also culturally change depending on the place of animals. But I think what makes the chinchilla, it has a value. It always has had a value since the fur industry started. But at the same time, it's cute and it's friendly. You can say that the bird or fox is cute, but they're wild. You're not gonna have your like a fox up there or like hug the bird. But the chinchilla you could. So it has that sort of intimacy that you don't find in too many other pets. But at the same time, it has a value. And like a hen, you can hold it. It's soft. And that is a lot of them you can see in the sources. But at the same time, there was, especially when they changed to like belting in the mid 1950s, some of the sources said some of our farmers are not ready to kill their pets. And they will move away from this, that they had been wrong because they established some sort of emotional relationship with that, but there was a lot of criticism with that saying, well, you need to be economically savvy and use it because that's the purpose of the industry.
Oh, we have another question online. All right, you want to go ahead and ask yours first, Elizabeth?
Whatever.
I think it's a pretty quick one online. It comes from Augusto Rocha. What is the status of chinchillas today in Chile?
Is endangered. It has been seen in some places. There's always, with this news of endangered animals that it returns. But it's still a very endangered animal. I think one thing that, for instance, happened a lot, and most of because there is animal extinction, that the animals start moving higher and higher in the Andes. So for instance, there are articles from the 1960s that said they could find chinchillas in places that had never been before because they keep moving further there. But it's still very endangered animals. It's still in captivity. And I think you can find one in Petco for $300. I saw them a few weeks ago. I went to visit them. It's like the same with cuyes and other animals that you can now buy them. But they're nocturnal. So if you get one, you have them all night like you. So it's kind of hard to.
Well, thank you again for this really incredible talk. It was so much fun. And I took a bunch of pictures and sent them to my daughter because she was sad to not be at the Chinchilla talk. But my question is, do they smell bad? Did the breeding farm smell bad when celebrities and others would go visit them? And then the other question is, how did they figure out that they're monogamous?
No, they don't smell bad.
Wow.
No, because they're vegetarians.
Oh, yeah.
So I that's what the sources are. They're very clean animals, and they clean themselves. And that also was one of the attractive things. That's supposed you need less labor because they're really clean animals and don't get sick. So they didn't suppose they're not. Usually it's the opposite. They said they're really kind of nice to have.
You can go get one. Yeah, no, I'll have to get one. And the other question is, how did they figure out that they're monogamous?
Yeah.
That they're monogamous.
Oh no.
How did they figure
They're
that
supposed to be monogamous, but then in the sort of large scale breeding,
Uh-huh.
they try to break that.
Huh.
And that's why they have changed though, because I mean breeding changed things, and being raised in captivity completely changed animals. So that's one of the things that they try to change their habits because you could reproduce them faster.
Interesting. Thank you.
So they have, there's a lot of change on the chinchillas. That's why they said what you have now is not what you have in the past.
Oh, go ahead. You can ask one. Yes.
I wanted to make a comment on cuteness of animals, how we perceive cute animals, and how people who use animals for other purposes perceive animals. I used to be a person that would camp and spend a lot of time in remote areas, and it was common for me to get rides and get picked up by natives. And I recall in Alaska, I was staying with some people, and they said, we're going out for a few days at sea otter hunting, sea otters with the fur, sea otter hunting season. We'll be back in a few days. And if you want to stay here, make yourself useful, you need to be the one that feeds the dogs while we're out. And I said, so how many days will you be? First I said, like I was aghast, like hunting sea otters because I'm from here. And I said, we have them in California as well, but I'm pretty certain they're protected and we think they're adorable. How can you hunt them? And they said, they're protected here too. We're natives and we have permission to hunt them because this was part of our subsistence. And we can take, in my memory, it's probably in a journal somewhere, but off the top of my head, I seem to remember that they said each person could take 50. And again, I went like, so I've never seen, because we don't hunt them, I've never seen a sea otter fur. And went like, what do you mean you've never seen one? And I said, I've never seen one. And they said, the bed you're sleeping in that's the cover that you're using is a sea otter. Get out of here with this. You've never seen one. And then again, I go like, so how many days will you be gone? And they said, we have no idea until each of us gets up 50. We're staying out at sea. And I said, but it must change from year to year. How do you know that you could get 50? And they went like, we will be out there until we get the full 50 each, because that's what we need to do. And so I wanted to just bring into perspective, because you said that one of your expertise is mining, yes? So you've also spent a lot of time in remote areas, not just in universities.
And I like
where
that.
people think
I mean,
things
that
are
makes me,
cute.
in many ways thinking about how hunting changed, especially in Chile, the late 19th century, from subsistence hunting, that people like local communities may have engaged, to this sort of mass scale hunting that was driven also by business and this demand from global markets. So there is, yes, you can keep hunting things, but there is a moment it becomes unsustainable. And that also, Carol, also explained a little bit what you were mentioning, how different people may perceive the animal also differently and what's the use of the animal. But hunting for kind of domestic use not necessarily could have been bad. The problem is when it became this sort of mild scale, global kind of market hunting.
So I lived part of the time growing up in Bolivia. My parents were missionaries in indigenous villages, very high in the Andes. Sometimes we'd be out hiking, 4,000 meters above sea level, and you'd see the vizcachas run away under the rocks. So vizcachas are related to chinchillas, and they have very soft fur as well. Why aren't there vizcacha farms?
Oh, the vizcacha?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, they're part of the same family. So I think I have it. Yeah. So there is the Chinchilla family and the Vizcacha family that are the same tree. They tried to hand the Vizcacha some point, but the fur was not as good as the Chinchilla. So it's sometimes called the sort of poor coat, in a sense that they could hunt it, but it didn't have the same value. They tried to bring them together, Vizcacha and Chinchilla, because there were more Vizcacha than Chinchilla, so they tried to bring them there to sort of increase the population, but it didn't work. But yeah, it's the closest. I love the Vizcacha. It's a cute one. Yeah.
Little white rabbits.
Are there any further questions on that?
No more Zoom questions right
Okay.
now.
All right. Well, I think we should thank Angela for a really fabulous talk.
And everyone, I'm watching on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. Please take a look at the Latin American Institute's website, international.ucla.edu/LAI. You can see our events calendar with all the other super cool talks and conferences and